Hello, thank you for joining us for Chapter 3 of Profusion's thoughts on UK marketing in 2017. To date, we have looked at very much sort of 2016 in review, looking at some of the key highlights, particularly across mobile, messaging and video. Our overall sort of approach is about the reintegration of marketing, speaking to the phrase that we're about marketing in a digital age rather than digital marketing per se. And to that point, I think it's very useful for this chapter just to take a step back and revisit the sort of consumer context, particularly from a socio-economic perspective, and specifically in relation to the recovery from the crisis of 2008. The last chapter covered off 10 key marketing themes for 2017, so you may want to revisit that one at some point. But now let's look at the consumer context for the year ahead. I mentioned just in that brief intro that it's very much focused on the socio-economics, and I guess the broad context is very much the recovery from the global financial crisis of 2008. These days I notice being referred to very much as the Great Recession, particularly by American commentators, so that seems to be widely understood now, the depth and the slow recovery from 2008 perhaps being the defining sort of feature of our time. So into that sort of febrile landscape, so a very, very slow recovery, historically the slowest since at least the mid-19th century. We have Brexit to contend with in 2017. Obviously we had the Euro crisis ongoing, but really spiked a couple of years ago, and now we have Brexit to manage with all of the issues surrounding that, whether it's the relationship between immigration and access to the single market, the medium to long-term implications for economic growth, question marks over employment, and indeed employment security. So a huge amount of unanswered questions, and inevitably another layer of anxiety to feed into the overall sort of consumer landscape. So more on the recovery. The title of this slide is not taken from the seminal 1980s TV series, but rather a paper by Andy Haldane, economist at the Bank of England, where he made the case that we could argue both ways, that this was the best of times and the worst of times, as a well-known author once said. And so on one set of metrics you can argue that the UK has never had it so good. At the time of writing he was referring to employment rates, interest rates and inflation rates. On another set of metrics you can paint the picture that the UK is experiencing the worst times in economic history, and to that point he was addressing metrics like productivity gains, for example. So there's always been this slightly confused picture, if you like. Commentators will dial up the metrics that suit their narrative best, if you will, but it's increasingly clear that there's no hiding place for the dark days in terms of UK incomes. Back in 2008 it seemed almost willfully negative to talk about the potential for a lost decade in terms of UK incomes, and yet it's almost upon us, and there's been some really detailed analysis sort of taken place, not least by Andy Haldane, again at the Bank of England economist there. A paper from last year called Whose Recovery speaks to exactly this question. One of the key takeaways from that is that only London and the South East of all the regions in the UK have seen economic growth since the Great Depression, and in fact that growth has been overall sort of predicated and owned by older audiences, so people aged 50 plus, speaking to a generational divide, London and the South East particularly, property owners within that mix, and fundamentally linked to property ownership is the wealthiest sort of 20% of society. That last point probably deserves a little bit of qualification. You'll have seen some recent coverage talking about earnings of the bottom end of the spectrum picking up faster than at the higher end, but crucially, of course, is the difference between day-to-day earnings and overall wealth, and the relationship between wealth and property ownership, pensions, etc. So Andy Haldane's analysis speaks to an older audience, London South East based property owning, doing okay, thank you, whereas the overwhelming majority are flatlining incomes, not declining wealth. And of course, massive challenges for the sort of youngest generation and those coming out of university looking to get on the property ladder and generate secure employment. How do brands respond to this? Because obviously it's a very variable picture, and indeed part of me wonders if now isn't the time for a new regional approach to sort of communications and brand positioning. Well, a key area is around simplicity. I'm grateful to Siegel and Gale for their Simplicity Index, which highlights those brands that are most successful in delivering a very simple experience for their customers and prospects. And this is a fantastic way of sort of cutting through so much noise, so much anxiety, and making sure that they're delivering exactly what people want, when they want it, how they want it. So a key sort of focus, I think, for brands in this complicated sort of economic landscape. Secondly, I think it's really important, and we've seen this through research over a number of years, that people are increasingly sort of alienated by the big, brash, bold brand promises. And they're looking for something more grounded, something more realistic, something that speaks to them and their circumstances. The image on your slide is, of course, taken from Gogglebox, and that strikes me as quite a nice sort of example of the type of communication and tonality, the sort of humanity, the warmth, the wittiness, but the empathy fundamentally that brands need to demonstrate. We understand your circumstances. We understand your challenges, and we're delivering simple and effective services, products and solutions to meet those needs. So that's a very brief look at the sort of socio-economic context. I think the key takeaways are there's very little disposable income for huge numbers of people across the country. Recently coined as the just about managing sort of segment, estimates suggest that is around 25 to 30% of the overall population. And don't make the mistake of assuming that's only people at the lower end of the earning spectrum or the income spectrum. Analysis suggests that that's just about managing sort of mindset extends up to people earning £60,000 to £70,000 per year, because obviously financial well-being has multiple sort of causes. So really important that you don't just assume it's just the people at the lower end of the spectrum who are feeling this squeeze, quite apart from anticipating how the squeeze may expand in the future with rising interest rates and inflation in 2017. So food for thought certainly, and one to bear in mind as we look to sort of integrate our marketing activities in 2017.